Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 16, June to July 1916. Over the next weeks, there was a slow, steady racketing up of tension. The roads going past the station seemed as busy as London streets almost, with regiments marching and transport convoys taking artillery, ammunition, and supplies to the front. The rest camp had doubled in size again, swollen with new men, some conscripts fresh from England, some veterans brought down from Flanders for the push. Many of the latter were fairly pleased to be here, where there were still trees and grass and buildings that hadn't been bombed to rubble, and making the most of the time they had. The station received vast deliveries of supplies, vast enough that Thomas's section was sometimes pulled off ward work to help unload and stow them. Patients were coming in steadily. The front was fairly quiet, waiting with breath held just like the rear was, but the sheer number of men passing through meant plenty of injuries, from accidents, patrols, and enemy shelling. The latter more likely than ever to hit something alive, with men so thick on the ground. They were moving them out fairly briskly, though. Anything requiring observation or convalescence sent rearward. Anything minor returned to the line as soon as it started to heal cleanly, and the greatest danger of infection was past. One day in mid-June, Captain Allenby told Thomas that all leave for officers had been suspended. "That means it's not long to wait now," he said. "Next we'll get orders to clear the wards. That'll mean it's starting in a few days." But the order to clear the wards didn't come, and men and material continued to pour in. It was almost the end of June when the tension finally broke. Major Thwaite called the parade for just after breakfast, and once they had saluted and been put at ease, said, "Gentlemen, as many of you will no doubt have guessed, we are building up for a push." There was a sort of gasp at that, though no one could have been surprised. A few of the new blokes tried to start up a cheer, then subsided into embarrassed silence when no one else picked it up. Once they were quiet again, the major continued. "This is to be the largest and most important battle of the war. In fact, the largest in which British troops have ever fought throughout our nation's great history. It will involve more troops, more guns, more ammunition than any battle that has ever been fought. If all goes well, it will go down in history as the beginning of the Allied victory, and we, just as much as the fighting men, have a vital part to play in the success of this great endeavor." Major Thwaite paused. This, Thomas thought, was where he'd expected the cheer to go. Finally, a few people humored him, and he moved on. "Here, then, is what we can expect. The preliminary bombardment begins today, any moment now, in fact, and will continue until Thursday morning, when the infantry is scheduled to begin their advance." Thursday. 6 days away. Everyone started murmuring a bit, and behind Thomas someone said, "Thank God we're in the R.A.M. bloody sea." "During the bombardment, we can expect moderate casualties from shortfalls, artillery accidents, and, of course, enemy retaliation. Master Sergeant Tooley will explain the adjustments to the duty roster during this time." Thomas looked at the wardmaster, who was standing behind Major Thwaite's shoulder. He looked grim. "We will be busy, and emotions will be running high in anticipation of the attack, but I expect each of you to keep to your assigned periods of rest and to take regular meals, so that we may be well rested and well nourished at the commencement of the infantry advance, after which we can expect to be considerably busier." There was another murmur at that. They all knew what busier meant, up to their elbows in blood and guts. "The attack will begin at dawn, but it is anticipated there will be little enemy resistance in the morning, as most of the enemy's front line will have been eliminated by the bombardment. There may be some casualties from close combat with small groups of survivors. Additional men will be placed at the regimental aid posts to receive these casualties, and bearer sections to move them rearward, as necessary." "Those poor sods are in for a day of it," someone nearby said. The major continued. "It is likely that we will also receive wounded prisoners, perhaps even more of them than of our own men. Let me remind you that once they have laid down their arms and surrendered to His Majesty's custody, they are to be treated humanely, and their injuries to be tended with as much care as we would those of our own countrymen." Discontented murmurings. Thomas heard someone say, "You won't catch me," and murmurs of assent from the men around him. Major Thwaite must have heard it too, or something like that, because he added,
You do not have to like it, but it is our duty under international law, and in the case of the medical officers under the Hippocratic Oath. We are civilized men, from a civilized country, and we will behave as such."
He moved on.
"After the infantry has consolidated the enemy's forward line, they will continue their advance to take the enemy's support and reserve trenches. These areas will not be as heavily affected by the bombardment, and so our men will begin to encounter serious resistance. Accordingly, we can expect significant casualties beginning in the afternoon, with numbers increasing as night falls and it becomes safer to move them."
Translation: nobody was going to be sleeping or even sitting down Thursday night.
"Heavy fighting and significant casualties may continue for several days. As it slows down, we can expect to see an increase in relatively light cases, as men who continued to fight in spite of their wounds become free to seek treatment. In addition, we will be setting up posts and advanced dressing stations in the newly consolidated areas."
Not sleeping Thursday night or any of the next few nights then. No wonder the Major wanted them to get their rest before it all started.
"It will be a difficult few days," the Major said, "but I have confidence that each and every one of you will rise to the occasion. Now, I ask the officers to join me in the mess for further instructions, while Master Sergeant Tooley will address the men."
The Wardmaster stepped forward. "Hup!" They all stood to attention and saluted the departing officers. The Wardmaster watched them go, then dropped out of attention and said,
"At ease."
He sighed.
"You are the Major. This is gonna be a fucking shit show and no mistake."
Behind them there was a crash of guns, like distant thunder. At least half the company involuntarily turned to look toward it, even though there was, at this distance, nothing to see.
"That's not gonna stop for 6 fucking days, so you might as well get used to it,"
the Wardmaster told them.
"Like you said, we're gonna start to see some casualties coming in almost right away. The artillery blokes are working like one-legged men at the world's biggest horse-kicking contest. They're gonna make mistakes, and Fritz ain't gonna be happy we're making all this noise. But this is just a fucking overture. Don't stretch yourselves too fucking thin. You new lads especially. There's gonna be times you get sent off to get your head down or have something to eat when there's still shit to be done. We don't want to hear, 'I'm not tired, Sarge. I can hack it, Sarge.' It ain't about that. We're putting you to one side so we can use you later when we need you more. Understood?"
"Yes, Sergeant," they all said.
"Starting tonight, we're going to have 2 groups on night duty. First line and reserve line. Reserve line bunks in the mess until you're called. If we don't need you one night, we'll sure as hell need you later. So if you're lucky enough to get the chance to sleep, fucking sleep. By the time this is all over, we're all going to be so tired we're seeing big fucking elephants. You don't need to give yourselves a fucking head start."
He went on to explain more details of the preparations. They'd begin clearing the wards of existing patients with today's rearward convoy and continue tomorrow, running dawn convoys as well as dusk ones if necessary. New patients would be kept only until the next convoy, no matter how light or how serious the case. Or, as the Wardmaster put it,
"No bugger is stopping the night unless he's expected to rejoin his unit. Or his maker, mother morning."
In addition to emptying out the wards they already had, they'd be setting up additional temporary ones under marquee tents. 2 proper wards with 50 beds in each, and 2 empty tents of the same size where walking wounded could wait out of the weather for their turn to be evacuated further back. And for evacuating them, the Transport Corps was rounding up every decently sized civilian vehicle they could find, from farm carts to charbanks. These, of course, would not have medical supplies stored on board, as the proper ambulances did, so the orderlies assigned to ride on them would have to carry everything they needed with them. The Wardmaster concluded by saying, "Assignments for 0 Day will be posted next week, and I don't want to hear any fucking complaints. Unless this goes extremely well, every bunker here is going to have a turn going up front to see the big show before it's finished." Over the next few days, the only subject on anyone's lips was the push, what it would be like, whether it would succeed, and most importantly, where each of them would be assigned on the day it all started, and which assignments were particularly lucky or unlucky. Thomas was a little surprised by how many of the men believed the push would succeed, and hoped to be placed somewhere close to the action on 0 Day. As far as he could figure out from what little they'd been told, the general staff did not have anything new in the way of strategy. They'd be doing the same thing that had failed at Ypres and Lewes. A bombardment followed by an infantry advance, just bigger. Thomas's section became even more optimistic when, on night duty, they were sent out to the collecting post to bring back wounded, there being too many to fit in the available ambulances. Ahead of them, in the direction of the front, the sky was lit up red like a sunset in the wrong direction. You couldn't see or hear individual explosions, just a continuous glow and roar. That was how many there were. The collecting post was only a little behind the artillery, and as they neared it, they could feel the vibration of the guns through their feet.
Not many Huns living through that, Widener said in general agreement.
Admittedly, it was hard to see how they could, and the station was seeing very few casualties from enemy shells. Tonight's larger-than-usual collection of wounded was reportedly the fault of a single malfunctioning piece of their own artillery, which had landed 2 shells in the British lines before exploding and taking out most of its crew. Word from the front was that the enemy was barely retaliating at all, perhaps because they were unable to. Thomas considered that if he were a German general, he'd not risk sending his artillery crews out in this nightmare to lob a few shells at the opposing trenches. They couldn't hope to match the British bombardment, not unless they had, by some astonishing consequence, also been stockpiling vast amounts of ammunition in this very spot for months. The smart thing to do would be to save their ammunition and keep their gunners alive until the bombardment stopped and the British infantry came out into the open where they could be picked off at leisure. Then again, German generals were likely just as short of common sense as British ones, so who knew? Perhaps they were shelling the hell out of empty trenches, the Boche already dead or racing back to Germany with their tails between their legs. Either way, when the wardmaster called him in the next afternoon to ask about his section's readiness, Thomas was able to report that they were keen and fit. The new men in particular are eager to see some action. He rounded down the list of ones who had been cause for concern. Hotchkins and Drover, the windiest of the lot, had settled down on this latest outing. Wallace and Eakins, the 2 little Cockney lads, had been gaining in strength over the last 2 months, and Erickson and Babcock, the asthmatic and the bad back, hadn't had any trouble last night. I'd still keep an eye on those 4 when it's a long day of strenuous work, but they should be all right for a while.
Good, the wardmaster said. I'm thinking of putting your lot down at the aid post.
On 0 day, he had to mean. What else could he be talking about?
Thursday morning, the wardmaster added. We won't know what the fuck to expect, so I need someone who could use his head.
I see, Thomas said. It did make sense. He'd been at the aid post before, for one thing, and he was good in no man's land. Well, they'll all be excited to see the start of the push.
It's not a soft fucking job, the wardmaster said, but it should be a good fit for you lads.
He explained that they'd be doing first aid and organizing the wounded for transport rearward by the Barrow sections under the direction of the regiment's medical officer, as well as bringing in wounded from no man's land.
You'll be able to rotate carrying wounded with the lighter jobs. That should help the weak buggers keep up.
Right, Thomas said, thinking about how he'd set up the rotations so it wouldn't be obvious that some men were spending more time on lighter work than others.
You'll have the regiment's designated stretcher bearers to help with that,
he said.
But the rest of them are under fucking orders not to stop and either are wounded. Either they make it back themselves or they wait for us to show up.
That was going to be a tough order for the men from the regiment to follow. Thomas knew from his time at the front last year there were always plenty of volunteers to go out after wounded comrades. They'd have to know they could rely on the stretcher bearers to be not far behind them.
You're good at field triage, the wardmaster went on, but in a thing like this, there's one more thing you've got to know. Bring the easy ones in first. A casualty that's near the parapet, or that has good cover most of the way between you and him, you get those before you go for the ones you've got to cross a lot of open ground to get to. You understand why?
Thomas nodded. It won't do anybody any good if we get taken out of commission ourselves trying to get to them.
Fuck it, spot on. You put it to your lads that way. Your job is to bring in as many other poor buggers as you can manage. And even if it all goes down the way the brass expects, there's going to be plenty to choose from. Now, if it's the walkover they think it's going to be, with most of the Hun already dead and the rest throwing up their hands and saying, Mercy, comrade, the moment they see our British pluck. You do standard field triage. Look for the ones that won't last if they aren't tended to, but have a chance if they are. Your new blokes won't know which they are, so it'll be up to you to pick them out for them. Make sure you explain the fucking logic beforehand, and tell them you don't want any fucking arguments on the day.
All right, Thomas said, thinking about which ones would argue.
It's gonna be hard,
The War Master added.
There'll be blokes lying there who ought to be dead, but are somehow still conscious enough to call out for help, and you'll have to pass them by. That's hell on a man's nerves, especially your sensitive types. You can stop and pump them full of morphine if that helps your lads keep going.
It took Thomas a moment to realize he meant pump the dying full of morphine, not his own men. All right. Then, just to make sure he understood what the Ward Master meant, he asked, how much morphine?
As much as it fucking takes.
Right, Thomas thought. That was what he thought. We'll take plenty, yeah?
Yeah. Now, if the fucking bombardment fails, and the boss is sitting there waiting to give our lads a warm fucking welcome, you're not gonna want to fuck around in no man's land any more than you have to. Grab whoever the fuck you can grab, and scarp it back to the trench. If it really goes to shit, you grab as many as you can grab while there's still infantry standing between you and Fritz, and then you make yourselves real busy treating and evacuating the ones you have, so no one gets the bright idea about sending you back out to look for more.
Thomas nodded a little dubiously.
There's no fucking shame in keeping your skin in one piece,
The Ward Master added.
An operation like this goes south, the brass get real fucking tempted to keep throwing bodies at it, trying to get something to show for it all. You don't need to get mixed up in that. You're ordered to go out, you go out, but use your fucking head. If trying to move the wounded is just going to get them and you killed, get them into a fucking shell hole or under some bit of cover, treat them as best you can, and tell them we'll be back for them at nightfall.
The little Cockney lads would be good at that, being small and quick, Thomas thought. He carefully didn't think about the fact that there were bound to be some wounded who wouldn't last until nightfall. I understand.
There's a decent chance we'll have more help by then,
The War Master added.
if it goes according to fucking plan, and they consolidate the enemy's first and second lines by afternoon, they'll be able to spare some men to go after their own wounded. If it all goes to shit, they can pick up some of their mates while they're in fucking retreat. We could also get to borrow some men from the reserve units if GHQ ends up not needing them at all for the attack.
The reserve units were the ones kept back to join the battle later if the first line units needed reinforcing. I suppose, Thomas said, the more casualties there are, the more likely the reserves will be otherwise occupied.
Yeah,
Said the Ward Master.
we'll see how it goes. Midday or so, once we have some fucking idea what we're dealing with, I'll send another section and 2 up. If they relieve you, it'll likely be because I want you out there again at night, so no fucking arguments about it either.
Yes, Sergeant, Thomas said.
Alright,
The Ward Master stood up from his desk.
I don't know about you, but I'm ready for a fucking drink.
So they had a fucking drink. Thomas, having gotten a great deal of practice dodging refills during his time as the War Master's clique, managed to keep it to 1 and rejoined his section in the mess. They were on wards, but since the wards were being cleared out with every convoy, all they had to do in the afternoon was get the ward ready for the next crop of patients, make the beds, restock supplies, and a few other things like that, and then wait for them to show up. Manning and Collins were there too with their sections, and Thomas soon figured out that they had just been meeting with their sergeants too. Did you find out where we're going to be? Rollins asked, filling a cup of tea and pushing it towards Thomas.
We're at the collecting post,
Manning added, indicating himself and Collins. Humping stretchers back and forth between them and the outpost all day, Collins added with a certain amount of pride. But they have us doing that too, Widener said. Right. Thomas hesitated. We're at the outpost. There was a moment's resounding silence until Manning said,
Fuck, jammy bastard! You're going to see the whole show!
I expect we'll be too busy to see much, Thomas said. You'll see some, Collins said. That's something to tell your grandkids. You were there the moment we started to win the war. Unless something changed drastically, Thomas wasn't going to have any grandkids, and he suspected that even if this did turn out to be the day they broke almost 2 years of stalemate and put the Germans on the run, it was mostly going to look like blood and chaos. But he didn't argue. You'll see plenty too when you come up to collect wounded, and the War Master said he'd likely send other sections up to the front later. He hadn't quite said that those sections would be Collins and Manning's, but he had said, once he was well into his second or third drink, that what he'd been telling Thomas about keeping out of the other two corporals' way went
straight out the fucking window when the serious shit hits. You've done a fuckload more work under fire than they have put together. If you need to take charge, take fucking charge.
While Collins and Manning's sections murmured amongst themselves about that, Drover asked,
"What will they have us doing at the aid post exactly?"
So Thomas relayed what the wardmaster had told him, with more detail.
Lot of first aid, putting on dressings, giving out morphine to the serious cases, rum and cigarettes to the rest, keeping them organized to be moved back in order of priority. Officially, the MO does the triage once they're inside our lines, but if there's more than he can keep up with, we make the first cut. Which ones he needs to see first, which ones can wait, and so on. The third category was ones they were going to leave to die, and Thomas was going to have to come out and say that sooner or later, but he'd work up to it, he decided. Which MO do we have?
Asked Rollins.
Bloke from the regiment,
Thomas answered. He hadn't asked which one, but he didn't know them anyway, and doubted anyone else did either.
We'll have his regular team too, 4 orderlies and a corporal, and about 20 stretcher bearers from the regiment to help with bringing the wounded in from no man's land.
There was another silence, with even Manning and Collins's blokes turning to look at him.
The regiment knows most of that, don't they?
Hutchkins asked.
Bigger than their own.
Usually, Thomas said.
From patrols and things like that. But when it's a push, they have to keep advancing. Once they're done with their job, they'll be able to come back and help if necessary. But for a while, it'll just be the ones assigned to stretcher duty. And us.
"Buck on me,"
said one of the Cockney lads. Thomas wasn't looking their direction, so he wasn't sure which.
Barrow's been in no man's land hundreds of times, Rollins said. He'll tell us how it's done. Not quite hundreds,
Thomas said. He'd only been at the front a few weeks, and he hadn't gone out every night. He talked a bit about how to move in no man's land, avoiding straight lines, ducking from one shell hole or bit of cover to the next, and avoiding barbed wire.
And I'm used to doing it in the fucking dark, he added. We'll be able to see where we're going.
"They'll be able to see us too,"
Drover pointed out.
Yeah, Thomas admitted. But keep in mind, we'll be behind the advance. Those poor bastards will be standing between us and the enemy. I'm not saying nothing's going to get through, but nobody's going to be aiming at us. With night work, you have snipers and machine gunners looking for any hint of movement. 0 day, they're going to be too busy dealing with what's right on top of them to worry about us at the back of the pack.
"Anyway,"
Manning pointed out,
"there aren't going to be many of them left alive by the time the infantry goes over the top, let alone you lot."
Everyone looked incredibly relieved at that. Unfortunately, Thomas couldn't let that stand.
That's the plan, he said. But who's heard the one about no plan surviving contact with the enemy?
I haven't, said Plank. Rollins thumped in.
You just did! Thomas explained. It could be they get their reserves into position faster than we think they can, or it could be they're dug in deep enough to last out the bombardment.
The Wardmaster had talked about both of those possibilities. A mate of his, apparently, had been in on the capture of a German trench, one of the few taken at Lewes, and had said that, in some places at least, their dugouts were much deeper than the British ones, and some of them, and many of their gun emplacements, were reinforced with concrete. The Wardmaster had also heard from yet another mate, this one in the artillery, that most of the barrage was made up of lightweight stuff, which made a lot of noise but wouldn't penetrate even the average British dugout, let alone the sturdy ones the Germans were rumoured to have. We won't know what to expect until we see it, so we need to be ready for anything. Hear, hear, said Rollins. That night they were on reserve for night duty, and so they bedded down in the mess. They'd learned through experience that while there was just enough space for everyone to lie down somewhere, with all the tables and benches in situ, whenever anybody got up to go to the latrine, everybody else got woken up by all the banging and swearing as they bumped into furniture and trod on people. So, step one was to pile all the furniture up at one side of the room. After that, everyone spread out their bedrolls and then sat up talking for a while. Thomas, being a corporal, had a prime spot next to a bit of wall he could lean against until he was ready to lie down. He was smoking a meditative cigarette when Rollins squeezed in beside him.
Reminds me of the old days in the barn,
he commented. Thomas knew what he meant. They were less chatty in the barn, now that they were 3 separate sections with different schedules. But he said,
I could dump a bucket of water over your head if you want the full nostalgic experience. Tempting, but I'll pass,
Rollins said. He lit a cigarette of his own.
So, how bad does he think it's going to be?
The wardmaster, he meant.
Bad,
Thomas said.
Even if the bombardment kills most of them, one man on a machine gun can take out a platoon or two before anyone gets close enough to throw a Mills bomb into the emplacement. The one man has to be a machine gunner, though, doesn't he? Rollins asked. The Warmaster says his mate says if their machine guns are anything like ours, it doesn't take an expert until it jams up or overheats. It will eventually. They're finicky, but until then any bugger off the street can make it go.
Huh, said Rollins, pushing closer against Thomas's side.
So tomorrow we've got to have a talk with the new blokes about field triage, he added, and about how if a man's too far gone to help, but conscious enough to draw attention to himself, the best thing you can do is give him enough morphine to shut him up.
Rollins said,
You mean, if necessary, yeah. He thinks it's going to be that bad? Could be. The other thing we need to talk about is how, if they don't take the German front lines as fast as the brass thinks, we focus on getting the ones close to home.
The wardmaster had elaborated on that a bit more once he'd started drinking, too. If the fucking Bosch are still in active resistance, stay outside their wire unless the fucking Ruperts give you no choice at all.
We start with the cases inside our wire, then the ones in the middle. The ones inside the enemy's wire, and any in a tricky spot, we leave until things cool down.
Rollins took a drag from his cigarette.
Not sure I like that. If it's that bad, we'll have enough to do without looking for extra trouble, Thomas said. And we have to still be standing when it cools down if we're going to be able to get them then. We end up needing help ourselves. We can't help anyone. Good point.
He shook his head.
It's hard to imagine. I mean, Rouse talked a little bit about what it was like up at Lewes, but... Yeah.
He hadn't talked about it much, and that alone had said a lot.
I don't expect it'll be anything we want our grandchildren knowing about. No, Rollins agreed. We'll tell them about the barn and Mittens. Grannies, suggested Thomas, and how sick we all are of plum and apple jam. And I'll tell them about my best mate from the war.
Yeah? Thomas asked.
Who's that?
Rollins gave him a dirty look.
All right, Thomas said. I guess I'll tell my imaginary grandchildren about you.
He was reminded of talking to Peter about the imaginary pub and whether or not they'd let ones like Syl in.
You're not having any real ones. Servants don't usually marry,
he said. That wasn't the real reason, of course.
Not in great houses, I mean. It's like entering a celibate order. You think you'll go back to that? Rollins asked. I haven't really thought about it.
If the big push actually worked, if Thursday morning was the beginning of the Allied victory, it might not be long before he had to start thinking about it.
I don't know what else I'd do. Seems like you could do just about anything,
Rollins said, yawning.
You sure took to this like a duck to water.
There was being able to do it, and then there was being given the chance to try. Thomas thought about his last real talk with Rouse, about the things Rollins would never be able to understand. He didn't really want to try to explain.
What about you? Going back to the paper factory? Oh, I don't know, Rollins said. I suppose I'll have to. Won't be easy, though. This hasn't exactly been fun, but it feels like we're doing something important, doesn't it?
Yeah, Thomas said, lighting another cigarette. Mattered more than endlessly polishing the same silver or carrying food and drink to people who had 4 perfectly sound limbs of their own.
Do you suppose there's much in the way of hospital work for men? Or is it all nurses? Don't know, Rollins said. You could stay in the RAMC, but the wardmaster would put in a word for you.
Thomas hadn't thought of that. He turned the idea over in his mind.
Wouldn't be like this, though, in peacetime. But it's a lot more like when we were at the CCS. Drills and inspections. You're good at those, Rollins pointed out. Ah, but if it's like that, I might as well be a footman again. Same sort of thing, really. Huh? Rollins gave him a quizzical look. Just polishing things and being invisible, Thomas said. Only indoors.
And you got to be picked up by your betters in places like the Criterion instead of Hyde Park.
There'll be lots of households looking for men servants once it's all over.
He could name several. Maybe he could take Syl's place at Lady M's, or Peter's as Sir H's valet. He shuddered a little involuntarily.
You all right?
Rollins asked, tucked up against Thomas's side like he was. He had to have faltered.
Someone just walked over my grave, Thomas said. Better talk about something else, yeah? Be a shame if we quit the whole thing, talking too much about after the war. I suppose it is tempting fate, Rollins agreed. All right, so what do you suppose Manning will come up with to convince himself he's got a more important assignment than Collins, even though they're doing the exact same fucking thing?
So they talked a bit about that, and then slid into talking about the new men and how they'd bear up and how superior their section was to Manning's. He thought the same thing in reverse, but the difference was that they were right. And so on until it was time to shout at everyone to stop chattering and go the heck to sleep. No time at all seemed to pass before Wednesday afternoon was upon them. Their section had been dismissed to get some sleep. They'd be reporting back at 2 a.m. to collect their supplies and then begin making their way through the jam-packed trenches to the aid post. But it was pissing down rain, and instead of making the trek to the barn or even to the new bloke's tent, they lingered in the orderly's room, smoking, drinking tea, and speculating about what the dismal weather meant for the attack plans. The rumors were about 6:40 in favor of it being postponed, and the bombardment had slowed to a trickle. The big guns didn't like the wet, but no orders had come in.
You could go and ask the war master,
Plank suggested at one point. We were dismissed 3 hours ago, Thomas pointed out. Not sure I want to draw attention to the fact that we haven't fucking left. Maybe we'd better go, Rollins said. You lot in the tent will hear when there's any news. One of you can come tell us. Everyone looked at Thomas. Right, he was the dad. It was his job to tell them it was past their bedtime.
I'm not stopping anyone from leaving,
he pointed out and lit a cigarette. I'm going to smoke this first, though. He was just about finished with it when Sergeant Purbright turned up.
Orders just came in, he said. All shows pushed back 48 hours.
Thank Christ, said Rollins.
Amen,
said one of the cockneys.
Any word on what we're supposed to do? Thomas asked. We were off duty until 2 a.m.
Yes, said Purbright. The Watermaster says that since you're all so fucking keen that you're still here when you're supposed to be asleep, you can take the next ambulance that comes in.
He bestowed a smirk on them before leaving. Oh, fuck, said Thomas. Unloading an ambulance in the pouring rain was never fun. It was likely to be hours before it came in, but if they were first up for it, they couldn't risk going anywhere or doing anything else in case it was early. Sitting here wasting time had been perfectly fine when they could stop any time they wanted, but it was not quite as enjoyable now that they had no choice. Honestly, it beats going up to the front in this slop, Rollins pointed out. That was true, but if they had actually left when they were supposed to, chances were fairly good they could have celebrated the news of the postponement by going out for a drink. Now, by the time they were set free, the estaminets would be crammed to capacity, every bugger else having had the same idea. Still, nobody was too down in the dumps about it, especially once it turned out that Erickson had gotten a parcel yesterday, which contained a large cake. The new blokes had been planning a midnight feast before reporting in that night, but having been just reminded how quickly things could change in war, Erickson was readily persuaded that now was as good a time as any to eat it. The next morning, the section was on the wards like any other day, tending patients who had come in during the night. Thomas happened to be in officers' medical, and one lightly wounded captain, throughout breakfast, kept taking out his watch and checking it. The reason finally became plain when, as Thomas and the others were clearing away the dishes, he announced,
7:30.
0 hour for the attack. If not for the postponement, the officers on the front would be blowing their whistles, and the men would be going over the top. For a long moment, no one said anything. Thomas and the rest paused in their work, half listening. Or at least Thomas was, for some change in the sound of the guns. Finally, one of the other officers said,
Why'd you have to say that?
They all shook it off and moved on, but somehow the pronouncement left Thomas with a queer, unsettled feeling, like he'd fallen through the other side of the looking-glass, and out in the real world the great offensive had begun unheard and unseen, but just barely felt by those of them trapped or sheltered in the mirror. The sense of eerie unreality persisted most of the way through to the new 0 day. Not all the time, just a flash of it now and then. Thursday evening, when he and Rollins slipped out for dinner at Granny's, Thomas dined on mirror trout, and later that night, when they were called out of their bedrolls in the mess to receive 3 loaded ambulances, Thomas thought for a dizzying split second between asleep and awake that the casualties must have fallen through the mirror from the battle outside. Really, a shell had fallen short into a crowded assembly trench. Friday, thankfully, no one drew attention to 7:30 a.m., and Thomas thought little about the mirror world except when the wardmaster called him in for a glass of mirror armagnac and a few words of advice, and then again when he returned to the barn to sleep in the afternoon. They weren't making the same mistake twice, and he marveled that the mirror cat made the same comforting weight on his ribs as the real one. The mirror was very much on Thomas's mind as they collected their supplies at the station, and again as they passed the collecting post and entered the communication trench, but he didn't feel it, not in that eerily immediate way. The trenches were jam-packed, men trying to catch a little sleep in any spot they could, others sitting up and smoking, writing letters, or trying to sing. A hymn here, a music hall tune there, even a group of dark-skinned men in turbans, singing in their native language. It was slow going in the crowded trenches, and they took a wrong turn once into an assembly trench that hadn't been there the last time Thomas had been this far forward. It was about 4:30 when they got to the aid post. The night was quiet, no shortfalls in this sector tonight, and there was only one orderly awake inside the aid post. Thomas was somehow completely unsurprised to see that it was Rouse. He was a little bit surprised to see that he had his stripes back, though.
"Hey," Rouse said. "Wondered if it'd be you." He explained that the medical officer, a Captain Rankin, would brief them at 6:30 and that until then they could rest in the storage dugout. "But keep it down," he said. "It's possible somebody managed to get to sleep." Once the others had crammed themselves into the storage dugout, Thomas lit a cigarette and, without discussion, the three of them, Thomas, Rouse, and Rawlins, sat on the steps leading into the dugout as they had sat on the barracks steps so many times the past winter. It was not quite as comfortable in the sweltering heat of the 1st of July as it had been in winter, but Thomas found he didn't mind. He put his head on Rawlins's shoulder, like he had that one time when he'd been half sedated and sick with missing Peter. His left elbow, trapped between him and Rawlins, pressed his cigarette case against his rib cage. He wouldn't look at it. He couldn't afford to be that distracted. But he wanted it with him for this. Some 3 hours later, the whistles blew and the mirror shattered. Thomas and the others were in the communication trench. Captain Rankin had posted them to the firing trench to begin retrieving wounded as soon as the advance had moved beyond them. But there wasn't room for them to squeeze in, so they'd gotten as close as they could. At the moment the whistle blew, men began swarming up the ladders. It was only seconds, perhaps 5, perhaps 2, before the first one fell back in. Someone shouted for a stretcher bearer, and Thomas took the nearest man, it was one of the Cockneys, and began fighting his way forward. By the time they got to the first casualty, 4 or 5 more had fallen, and an officer was waving his sidearm and shouting, "Get your arses up those ladders, you sons of mothers!" The man who had caught the first one to fall shoved him in Thomas's direction and gave him a wide-eyed look before turning to get his arse up the ladder. The casualty was dead. He'd been drilled right through the forehead like an ox being slaughtered. Thomas and the Cockney lad, it was Eakins, dragged him out of the way. They found a dugout nearby, someone's sleeping place, maybe even this man's, and put him inside. By now the rest of the section had made their way into the trench and were attending to the others who had fallen back in. At least a dozen by now. Hutchkins and Babcock approached, carrying an obviously dead man between them.
"Is this where we're putting them?"
asked Babcock. "Yeah," Thomas said and raised his voice. "Dead in here. Anybody got a live one?"
"Help,"
said Plank, raising his hand like they were in a classroom. The man's chest was blown open, but Plank had gotten his field dressing out and was lashing it in place in approved fashion. "Right," Thomas said, finding a larger dugout. He designated that one for Triage C's, hopeless cases, and helped Plank put the first one in there. "A's on the fire step," he reminded everyone. A's were priority cases, the ones that had a chance but needed immediate attention. They didn't have any A's yet. They started getting B's, cases that could wait for attention, almost immediately, though, as they crawled back to the trench and dropped in. Thomas designated another sizable dugout for them, and as he started slapping field dressings on them, told them to make their own way back to the aid post when and if they felt able. "It's bad out there," he said. "Might be a while before anyone can help you." "Barrow!" someone yelled from outside the dugout. "We've got more!" "Put him somewhere!" he yelled back. Then to the men inside the dugout, he said, "If you have use of both your hands, put your own field dressing on. Then check if the bloke to either side needs help with his. Understand?" Getting a few nods of assent, he ran back outside. A few more dead had dropped out of the sky, and a great many more walking wounded, and one who dragged himself back with his arms by the look of it, trailing his intestines behind him. Drover, who was helping him over the parapet, stumbled backward and vomited. "A man who should be dead but isn't," the wardmaster had said. Thomas's hands shook as he reached inside his haversack for a syringe and a bottle of morphine. But they only shook a little. Once it was over, Babcock appeared at his side and wordlessly handed Thomas a bayonet dropped by one of the first casualties. Thomas felt a glimmer of understanding of how others felt when they heard the hand story. Because yes, obviously they couldn't leave him hanging there halfway in the trench. Not with the second wave already coming up the communication trench, and it would take a hell of a lot more than sons of mothers to get them over the top if they saw that. And nobody was going out there to untangle the rest of him from the barbed wire, so there was really only one thing to do, But Thomas found the place inside his head where he had lived those first few months that he was here. He never quite noticed when he left that place, but now that he needed to be there again, it was as though he never had. "Duh," he said, took the bayonet and cut the body free so they could move it out of the way. They had it stowed in the mortuary dugout just as the second wave came up. The second wave made it a little further than the first. At least only 2 of them fell back into the trench before they'd finished leaving it, and it took a few moments for walking wounded to start making their way back in. While the others dealt with them, Thomas had a look through the trench periscope. Captain Rankins had said they'd probably make their first foray to retrieve wounded between the second and third waves, but he'd also said that they should wait until the first wave was inside the German wire and any surviving enemy are fully engaged with countering the advance. If they waited for that, they'd never have to go, since as far as Thomas could tell, all of the first wave was lying on the ground. Some obviously dead, some crawling back toward the trench, a few absurdly crawling the opposite direction, still trying to advance. Thomas supposed they'd gone someplace inside their heads, too. "Do we have to go out yet?" someone asked, one of the new men. Thomas couldn't be bothered thinking about their names. "Not yet," he said. "Maybe after the next wave." In fact, it was 2 more waves before any appreciable number of troops survived as far as the German wire. The wave after that, most of them made it that far. Thomas was pretty sure that meant the enemy was fully engaged. He called his section together. "It's time," he said. "We go out in pairs. First up are me and Wallace, Rollins and Erickson, Hutchins and Babcock. Widener will assign the rest of the pairs. First 3 pairs go out, one right after the other. After that, one pair gets back, the next goes out. Don't spend any more time out there than you have to. Before you go, take a look through the periscope, pick out somebody you can tell is alive. Make sure you and your partner are both looking at the same one. And that's inside our wire. We're inside. We're not staying out there long enough to untangle anybody this time around. If you get to your bloke and realize he's entangled, pick somebody else. Understand?" They nodded. "Remember what we talked about. We get the easy ones first, because that's how we bring in the most. Let's try and do 3 trips each, then we stop and take stock of what we got. All right?" More nods. That was all Thomas really had to say, but he realized belatedly that he should have thought up an inspiring way to end his speech. Peter would have had some idea of the right thing to say, but what? "This is a shit job," he said, "but somebody's got to do it. Probably not that. If anybody has a good reason it shouldn't be us, I'm all fucking ears."
Definitely not that.
Thomas hadn't been trying to be funny, but they laughed at that, and it made the moment seem less fraught, at least. "Nobody? All right, then I guess we're it. Let's go." They went. Had anyone asked Thomas at that moment, he'd have said that place he'd gone inside his head notwithstanding. He had just as much desire to live as the next bloke. He'd have gone on saying that as he and Wallace scrambled back into the trench with their first casualty and as they picked up their second. He'd even have said it as they scrambled back out of the trench after their third. But when it came, a blow to the chest like a kick from a cart horse, it came as the answer to a question he'd asked a year and 2 months ago, when he'd taken the telegram out of the boy's hand, the boy who was haloed in sunlight like a saint at the kitchen door of Downton Abbey. He had blinked, and then the door had been closed, and Anna had been standing beside him with tears in her eyes. Now he was back inside that moment, the eternity of that eye blink, falling weightless through a void of unfathomable depth. And when he hit the ground of a field in the Somme River Valley of northern France, his last thought, before darkness swallowed him whole, was, finally.